Hi. My name is Nichelle Carr. I'm class of 1998. Oh yeah, I have my name tag on. I'm Nichelle Carr, class of 1998, and thank you so much for joining us for this conversation about the Black Women of Amherst College podcast and kind of the history generally. We've titled this Continuing the Conversation because we're very interested in talking about some of the things we didn't get a chance to talk about in the podcast, as well as kind of deepening the conversation about the podcast itself. And I'll talk a little bit about that. I'll just say I had the great privilege of producing and hosting this podcast, I should say award-winning podcast. I think the college mentioned that. Which really was the brainchild, actually. So the original idea came from Biddy Martin, past President Biddy Martin, and past Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer Norm Jones. And Norm approached me and said, hey, we want to update the Black Women of Amherst College book in a different medium for the new times. We were thinking a podcast. And he was like, you're a producer, can you do that? And I'm like, I've never done a podcast before, but yeah, sure, absolutely, no problem. No problem. So yeah, we just made it work. So the podcast, it is called Black Women of Amherst College because I wanted it to be a direct update. So the title is not particularly pithy, but it's very clear, and I wanted it to be a direct update of that book. I really wanted to point and pay homage to that book, even though the book does very different things than what this podcast does. So I'll talk about the podcast a little bit. So it tells the untold story of how Black women throughout Amherst College's history, including before education, as featured on NPR's Here and Now. Black Women of Amherst College spotlights, quote, the invisible work of Black women, unquote, in higher education and throughout society. The podcast builds upon the work of Black Women of Amherst College by the late Professor Mavis C. Campbell, published in 1999, and it expands upon this work to tell a multidimensional story of Black women that, one, incorporates students, alumni, faculty, administrators, and staff, and illuminates the distinctive and influential contributions of Black women to Amherst College, as well as the similarly distinctive and influential contributions of Amherst Black women to the world at large. So I will say this was truly a labor of love for me. It was an honor to speak with so many Black women, alumni of the college, the staff and the faculty who supported us while we were here, and for them to trust me with their stories. Some of their stories were really difficult. Some of their stories were really joyous. Some of their stories were really funny. Some of their stories were really shocking. And it was wonderful that they felt comfortable sharing those with me, knowing that I was going to then share them with the world. And I have to say, the most important thing, the team who I worked with, the most important thing, and we were a small but mighty group, for me, I kept saying, and it was true, the heaviest thing on my mind was to make sure that above all else, this podcast resonated for Black women. That they saw themselves in what they heard, and that they felt well represented, that they felt that I had done right by them. Considering how often and how deeply Black women have been overlooked, dismissed, and degraded, I cannot overstate how important it was to me to get this right. It was the only thing that just scared me. It really, really scared me, and it was really important. So to get the positive feedback that I've gotten from Black women of Amherst, from Black women generally, and then even from people who are not Black women, who are not related to Amherst College, who felt something, felt moved, felt that they learned something, is just the biggest gift. So with all that said, today we're gonna continue this conversation. Hopefully there will be more. And I'm delighted to be joined by this esteemed panel of amazing Black women of Amherst College. So next to me is Kyndall Ashe. I'll give each of their names and then they'll introduce themselves quickly so that we can get to the conversation. So Kyndall Ashe from the class of 18, then Katherine Chen Abrikian from the class of 2008, and then Nadia Biassou from the class of 1988. Nadia, do you want to start and give us your name?
Well, yes, thanks. I'm extremely proud that Nichelle asked me to participate in the podcast that she was doing and on this panel. And really I'm extremely proud of the work that she's done. It's amazing. Yes, I am Nadia Biassou, class of 1988. I was an English major and pre-med. And I live in Northern Virginia and work at NIH as a physician scientist.
And really quickly, Nadia is a former Amherst Wade Fellow.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Katherine Chen Abrikian. I'm class of 2008. I was an English and political science double major. I now live in Washington, D.C., and I'm in the middle of a career change. I worked for 10 years in international development, and now I'm moving into tech. So I work as a software engineer at Anaconda. Sorry. Yes.
Thank you for that.
Is this better? All right, let's
All right,
go.
salt the candle.
People tell me I should have a podcast of my own. No.
I feel like you should.
Hi, everyone.
Hey, go ahead.
I'm Kyndall Ashe, class of 2018, sorry, oh my goodness. I currently reside in San Francisco, California, and I was a math and sociology double major. For occupation, I work at LinkedIn as an account manager as well, so thank you.
Great. So I do want to say this will be a frank and candid conversation. All of the opinions expressed here are those of the panelists and not of their affiliated organizations, employers, or governmental entities. And we invite your participation throughout. There will be a Q&A, and we can absolutely chat about anything else that may come up, such as the making of the podcast, any of the behind-the-scenes questions you might have. I'm happy to get into that. And again, this will be a conversation, not a lecture, so feel free to chime in with questions or thoughts throughout. I'll give a brief overview for folks who haven't yet heard the podcast. It's 6 episodes, about 30 minutes an episode, and I'll just give a brief overview of what we chat about in each one. The first episode is called 200 Years of Amherst College. We talk about the history of the college. We talk about Edward Jones, the first Black graduate of Amherst College in the class of 1826, who was admitted with the expectation that he would then go, quote unquote, back to Africa, despite the fact that he was born and raised in the United States as a missionary. We talk about Dr. Anna Julia Cooper, who I call the mother of Black Amherst, who's also known as the mother of Black feminism, who was the educator responsible for creating the pipeline to Amherst for Black students from a very well-known high school in Washington, D.C., then called the M Street School, now called Paul Laurence Dunbar High School. So some of the esteemed Black graduates we know about, like Charles Hamilton Houston, William Hastie, Charles Drew, were as a result of the work that she did in building a relationship with Amherst College. Even though her female students couldn't go there, they went to Smith and Mount Holyoke and other places. Then we also talk about the legacy of former president of Amherst College, Alexander Meiklejohn, who was president from 1912 to 1924, and he was an early trailblazer in diversity and inclusion at Amherst College. And then we talk about the dawn of coeducation at Amherst College as well. So episode 2, called The Song of Sonia Sanchez, we talk about Black studies and Black intellectual thought and how Black students engaged in activism to get a Black studies department here very early in the invention of Black studies around 1970, 1973. And Sonia Sanchez came to campus as a result of those protests in 1972. She left the campus in 1975. It was not an easy experience for her, but she made an indelible mark while she was here. And she was also here to witness an event that marked the college and still marks the college today, the death of Gerald Penny, whom the Black Cultural Center in the Octagon is named for. She knew Gerald Penny as a student and was here to help the students and the college cope with his untimely and tragic death. He was a freshman. He had barely started classes. And we also talk about her journey in Black Studies and Amherst College's journey as a Black Studies department, going from a thriving young department to going through a fallow period and now being one of the strongest Black Studies departments in the country. And then in the third episode, we start talking to Black alumni themselves. So we talk about various issues. We talk about culture shock, seeking space for self-expression and joy, Amherst Black Freshman Orientation, which has been through many names and many iterations, and it's one of those things that we have it, and then we lose it, and then we have it, and then we lose it, and then we have it, and then we lose it. And right now, I think it's called Incubator, and it's focused on the sciences right now. We talk about code switching, we talk about colorism, classism, and rejection from one's own. We talk about the high cost of authenticity, the importance of sisterhood, and learning to thrive in a predominantly white institution. In the fourth episode, we talk to more alumni. The point of the podcast is definitely getting their stories and raising their stories. So we talk about different expressions and definitions of Blackness. So say from Black folks who are not from the United States, perhaps, and their different perspective. The changing role of the BSU, LGBTQIA intersectionality, the challenges of dating at a predominantly white institution, beauty and desirability from the perspective of the Black woman, the high stakes and financial angst of being a first-generation college student, dealing with entitlement and microaggressions, the struggle of academics versus activism, especially for us students who are what we would call a minority, but which is, no longer the case perhaps at Amherst. And we talk about the concept of Black girl magic. In the 5th episode, Activism at Amherst, we talk about Black women and the undue burden of reforming institutions. We talk about the 1979 takeover of Converse Hall, the 1992 takeover of Converse Hall, how Black women and Black women's leadership roles in both of those takeovers. We talk about how young Black women tackled a larger STEM education problem at Amherst, a problem that I think lingers today, but there's work being done on it, and a lot of that work comes out of what was uncovered when those young Black women in 1995 uncovered what they did. We talk about the Forum on Academic Concerns of Black Students. That was the protest that they staged, so it wasn't a takeover, it was a forum that they staged. We talk about Being Human in STEM, which is a more recent initiative that has become a model for other universities such as Yale and Brown. And we talk about the genesis and impact of the 2015 uprising. We also talk about at Black Amherst Speaks, which is an Instagram account started by this person right here, co-founded by her, which keeps Black voices in the forefront. Even if there isn't another platform for them to speak, there's this one. They can speak using their name or anonymously. And then in the final episode, the next 200 years of Amherst College, I sit down with Biddy Martin, who was in her last year of presidency at the college and had been president for 11 years at that point. So she was really the best voice to speak to all this. And I put all of the questions that we uncovered and raised in the previous episodes, I put them in front of her and had a very thoughtful conversation with her about that. So, quick overview. So for you all, as we're thinking about this, like I said, it's gonna be a conversation, and we're gonna get to questions and conversation as soon as we can. A few questions for you to be thinking about as you're listening, and if you have heard the podcast, some of the things that we'd love to chat with you about afterwards. So a few questions for all of us to think about. What stood out to you the most, again, as you're listening or from the podcast if you've heard it? What moved you, surprised you, or angered you? What did we miss or overlook in this conversation or in the podcast? What did we get wrong? What would you add from your perspective and experience? What is the value or usefulness of this podcast and similar oral histories to young people, to Amherst students, and to those who teach and work with young people, and as well as to Amherst and other colleges and universities, and anyone else who you think this kind of oral history might be useful for? We'd love to talk about that. And what advice do you have for young people, for Amherst students, for Amherst and other institutions of higher education as they become more diverse? So hopefully we'll get to chat about that. Right now with this group, I want to start with a topic that we touched on briefly in the podcast, but can definitely talk about more, and that's class and how it intersects with race. So, Kyndall, if you could talk to us about how you perceived class, and I think we're gonna try to talk about class from both ends of the spectrum. So, Kyndall, if you could tell us how you perceived class.
Sure. Thank you for that summary. I think it's very helpful to hear about all the different topics. With regards to class, obviously there is a lot to unpack. I was also a sociology major here at Amherst, so I got the chance to read a lot of books around the complexities and the intersectionalities of that topic. Speaking personally, I think, we're diving sort of right in. Speaking personally, one interesting aspect of my experience, and I think answering one of your questions too, what did I get out of the podcast, is that there's a lot of varied experiences, so just prefacing that my experience is not necessarily representative of everybody. In fact, it's not representative of a lot of people, and so, but speaking personally, I come from a family of two educated parents. They both are lawyers, so they're both have graduate degrees. And I grew up, with means, if you will. I mean, to put it in a matter of words. And so coming to Amherst was interesting because for those who don't know, representationally, there are a lot of Black students on campus. If you look, when I came to visit and you look around, there are a lot of people that look like me and look like us here on the panel. But when it comes to class, it was a very interesting experience for me, where I didn't find a lot of Black people, specifically Black women, from my sort of same class, if you will. I don't know the best way to say that. Anyway, so it was very interesting because I found myself straddling two communities, some of the more private school, prep school, white communities, as well as more of the racially Black communities. And it was difficult. And I know the first thing that a lot of people hear or think when they hear me say this is, that doesn't sound like that much of a struggle. I mean, everyone has their own, right, their own stories and their own struggles. So anyway, that was my experience. And so it was hard to kind of find where I fit. I'm not sure that I did. I have a handful of friends here that were in the same boat. But that's sort of my experience. And I just found it interesting, I think, that at Amherst, more of an elite institution, that was an outlying experience in my case.
Mm-hmm. And Katherine, you mentioned that you went to Deerfield Academy, yes? And we didn't get a chance to talk about it in the podcast, but there's this idea that I know is true for me, the idea of growing up in middle class or even affluent culture, and that not necessarily being your actual economic class.
Yeah. Yes, thanks, Michelle. So coming from Deerfield, I mean, it was interesting because I was on financial aid here, I was doing work study, but a lot of the things that, like, even in the podcast, people talk about experiencing for the first time at Amherst, I'd already experienced 2 years before. So I came to Deerfield as a junior, and, like, my essays were, like, marked up, and they didn't use red pen because they didn't want to, like, stress you out, so you used green, and I was stressed out. But when I came to Amherst was easy. I'm not saying that from a place of hubris, like, as in Deerfield really just taught me everything I needed to know in a very hand-holdy way about how to restructure my essays and how to ask for help. And I can't say that I had, like, the super best experience there. I actually prefer Amherst. But it meant that when I walked into my English classes, like, I won the freshman year English prize. And that was because I had had that before, So at the same time, it was a really weird space because, there were a lot of things that as I said, I kind of took into account, and you're like, okay, I can do this, or I can manufacture myself in this way to kind of fit in with this group, and you can fit in with that group. And I've talked with other people about, when you're raised in multiple different spaces, how it means that you can sometimes be a chameleon in all of those spaces, but you never really fit in fully to any of them. And that was a lot of my experience, in which I was really grateful that I had the opportunity to be part of the vibrant Black culture at Amherst. But at the same time, if I wanted to look preppy, I could know the exact shade of khaki that I had to wear, like the jeans are a faux pas. Also, like, in my year, they had accepted an unusually small amount of Black students. It was under 10 Black students. I don't remember if it was 7 or 9, and, like, we all knew each other. We were very, very different, so we were not necessarily all friends. But part of the dialogue around that was whether it was because they had accepted an unusually large amount of Black students the year before, and whether they had adjusted the admissions criteria to account for that and over-adjusted. So even when I talk about, like, having a vibrant Black population, a lot of that were 07s. They were not actually 08s. The 06s, not actually the 08s. So it was sort of a very interesting, weird, and in-betweeny space, I would say, to be in.
Mm-hmm. And Nadia, how do you feel about, both of these women have talked to us about how class is perceived, and how people have certain expectations around class. How do you feel those expectations in your life, even today, let's say? And maybe during your time at Amherst as well, but even today, how do you feel those?
I have to agree with what they have said. I think that both groups, African Americans, Caucasians, actually I think all groups, have a very set definition of what they think Black is. Mm-hmm. And when you don't fit either group's definition, you're kind of, almost in a way, ostracized by both. Mm-hmm. And I grew up in a family in a black family, very well-educated people who were mostly international. My parents were not born and raised in the United States. They were professionals who came here from other countries and grew up in black countries, where whoever was going to be the #1 person in biology was going to be a black person. And that set certain expectations that they had of their children, and the entire community had of different people. And that was black. You were expected to get A's. If I got a 95, my father would pull the paper and say, you missed 5 points. Go get the piece of paper. There must be something you didn't understand. You know, and so I said, well, I think 95 is pretty good. You know? So he'll say, well, go get the paper. And then 40 minutes later, after my eyes have glazed over, he's like, do you understand why you missed the 5 points? I'm like, I understood it 20 minutes ago. I don't understand it anymore. But that was the expectation. And that was the expectation for everyone, and that was black.
And then when you work today.
And when I left, actually, after I left Amherst, I think I became more aware of what other people's definitions of black was. And I think when I was here, there were probably people who thought she's running away from being black. I wasn't running away from anything. But they had the perception that I was. And when I went on to graduate school, then people had other perceptions of what it was that I should be interested in. Because as a black person, you should be interested in this, even though I wasn't interested in that. And I remember very clearly there was a young man who I was friends with who kind of thought of himself as being progressive and liberal. He was a white guy. And he wanted to go and support a friend of his who was an African-American gentleman who had been asked to give grand rounds for internal medicine. And it's a big honor. And he said, I wanted to go and support so-and-so. And I said, that's great. And he said, you know, I want to go and do that because, you know, he's black. And I said, what does that mean? And he got annoyed with me that I said that. And he thought I was just being difficult. And I said, well, what does that mean? And he said, well, you know, he's the first person to go to college. You know, his parents are uneducated. And I said, so what do you consider me to be black? Because my parents are not, I'm not the first person to go to college. My parents were well educated. Is that not black to you? And it really made me realize that people have their very set definitions of what it means to be black. And sometimes they act on it if you don't conform with that. So it's been a learning, a lifetime of learning, but you have to realize, you have to kind of figure out how to navigate that so that you can achieve what it is that you want to achieve. And now I find that I spend a lot of time with students of color, in particular African-American students, to say, black is all of that, okay? And you need to be proud of it. You need to take ownership of it. And never let anybody tell you what you should be interested in because of their preconceived notions of what you represent. And so that's been kind of my focus now, probably in the last 10 to 15 years. In my work at NIH, I'm a physician there. I've been there for 17 years. There's a dearth of senior scientists and very few people who are entering the field. And when I became the Amherst Wade Fellow, one of the things I really wanted to make sure that the students who were of color, who are interested in STEM, but kind of, I don't know if there are not that many people, there's not that much diversity in science, should I go into that? I tell them, please, take this time while you're here to understand what it is that you are really passionate about. Because when you do that work, it's very difficult for people to throw you off because you're so grounded. and because they will, or try. And I find that when you have done that, when you've really done that work to figure out what you're truly passionate about, that's what's going to pull you through a lot of the nonsense that you're going to go through, because you will go through it.
And if I can chime in on expectations, you kind of read my mind there. I was also a STEM major here at a liberal arts college, which is an interesting experience in and of itself, but being one of the few Black math majors at the time, I think expectations is a big part of it. I come from a line of Black women math majors, which is not that common. My mom was one and my grandma was one. So like in my house, it was very much like that. If that's something you wanted to do, like that's what's expected. It's expected to go to college. It's expected to get a graduate degree. And I think bringing it also back to campus for me, I think it's interesting too because Amherst does do a really good job, as I mentioned earlier, with getting students from a lot of different backgrounds. But then, you know, once I was here, it's interesting that for me, that was an expectation, but for some students that didn't come from certain households, you know, it wasn't necessarily something that was built into their brains that they could do, like Nadia was just saying. And I think one experience I witnessed here at Amherst was, you know, the lack of support that a lot of those students got in STEM. You know, how would a student from a certain background know to go to office hours, right, and spend a lot of time with professors one-on-one and feel the confidence to do that. Also, when I was on the presidential task force for diversity and inclusion as a student representative, right after the Amherst uprising, it was very interesting, some of the data that we saw around the dropout rates. And it's very, very disproportionate that Black students were dropping out and not coming back. And a lot of people don't know that and don't really care or to know that or do anything about that. And so I think when it comes to expectations, that was something I definitely saw not well supported here. And I sort of was a big advocate for trying to help, you know, people with maybe not the right expectations from others really still thrive and excel here.
Right. You actually touched on something I wanted to address as well, which is, I'm calling it reconciliation and restoration. One of the topics we did not get to discuss in the podcast I really wanted to talk about were the Black women who didn't make it through college, or if they did, they have been scarred by the experience. And how do we move forward from there? How does the college move forward from there? I would love to hear and actually, it's funny, in preparing for this reunion, one of my reunion co-chairs brought up the fact that there's a disproportionate number of Black women who have passed away earlier than expected, or even soon after college. And he was like, did you guys talk about this in the pod? Like, what do you think? And I was like, yeah, we would have loved to talk about that, but that was one of the ones that was just a little bit too hot of a topic. I would love to hear your thoughts on, because we actually really wanted to bring some women who maybe didn't graduate, but still had ties to the college, bring them back and have them kind of talk about what that experience was like, how they view the college now, and what they would say to the college to maybe have prevented that from happening or helped them to prevent that from happening in the first place. So I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts. It may not have been your direct experience, but maybe what you observed and what your thoughts are. And that's also one of the things that I would love the audience to think about here, because I bet there are some stories here in this audience that it would be great for us to kind of discuss and talk about as well. Go ahead.
If I can take a crack.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think that, at least from what I have seen in working with some of the students as the Amherst Wade Fellow, it seems like they've lost their confidence. They come in to Amherst with a tremendous amount of confidence. They're very successful. That's the reason why they were accepted. But it seems very quickly in their career, they lose their footing. And so one of the things that I did as the Amherst Wade Fellow was to really remind them of their exceptional nature and the reason why they were accepted here. It was not because you were unqualified and they were trying to fill a quota. You got the position because you were qualified. And I think they really need to hear that often. I don't know how often that is said to them, but I think that that's something that they need to hear often, and not just here at Amherst, but I think in general we need to hear that. And we're often overlooked. A lot of the accomplishments and achievements that we achieve in our careers, it's not just here in our education, but beyond Amherst, is often overlooked or often asked to be done in an informal way that's not officialized. And I think that I think we need to hear that, but we can give them that kind of fellowship. I think that's really important, and I think that having that kind of in a way where your efforts are being mitigated. You're working at 200, 300, and 400%, but you're never seen, and sometimes it's deliberate that you're not seen. Those do have translations for health and health disparities. NIH has an entire institute looking at minority health and health disparities, where this is not, it's not a perception that we do have those things. We do in our community: increased stress, diabetes, hypertension, all of those things that can shorten life. And I think that those are real factors. Probably starts early on, but it continues throughout our life.
Other thoughts? There's a bunch of things I want to touch on that you opened up, but yeah, let's go to our thoughts.
Yeah, I had sort of three thoughts. The first was that about a year after I graduated, the college released a report on sort of depression and anxiety in the student population, and they talked a lot about the alienation of specific groups, particularly with an emphasis on low-income students and students who were from non-white racial backgrounds or non-white ethnic backgrounds. And a friend who was white and male called me up and he was like, "Oh my gosh, this is horrible. I didn't even realize this. Let's do something about it." And I was like, no. I was like, this report was not a shock to me. I knew these people. I talked to these people all the time. These people were my friends. And the fact that you, 4 years in, super close to me, are just now realizing this is a thing, I can't do anything with you. And he was really upset about it. And I was like, you just gotta take that, you gotta sit down. And he did, to his credit. But like that's, I feel like that really summed up a lot of the experience here, that feeling of like, yeah, you're giving the most, you're doing the most, and you're still not feeling like you're part of the student body, you're still not feeling like you belong here. I only knew really of 2 Black women who dropped out. One came back, and so she came back a semester later as an E, and she just really just kept her head down. She never really reintegrated into like social life on campus. She was just like, I'm here to get my degree and I'm here to get out. And the other one was sexually assaulted our freshman year in the first semester. She was in my dorm and she just never made it out of that experience and she never came back. And like, that's a whole nother can of worms, but that was the experience. And there are so many more who just like, yeah, they put their head down and they swum through the current and they got there. And the third thing I thought about was the Black student table at Val. Like when I was here, you would walk into Val and all the Black students would kind of sit in the alcove. And Beverly Tatum published that book, like where are all the Black students sitting together in the cafeteria? And that was Amherst. And we constantly have to fight articles in the student newspaper explaining to peers like why this was a necessary thing to kind of just be rejuvenated. And the joke was that it wasn't even all Black students. Like Latina students were there. Like white students could come, but they didn't. So like, and I feel like that really also just was so emblematic, I think, even of, if we get to talking about Herminia T. Gardner Bicemester, experience, like if you were not Black, you could integrate with the Black students on campus, and many people did, but then those people were also rendered invisible because the Black students were rendered invisible. They'd be like, there are no white people, and I'm like, I'm sitting beside Matt Masholi, what are you talking about? So like, so that's really what I thought about.
So there's a couple things in there. So much. It makes me think, so it goes back to your point about expectations, right? If there's low expectations and we're trying to fight and achieve in spite of those, but we're constantly getting the message of low expectations, it puts us on the back foot from the very beginning. I also think about Black Girl Magic, and this is something that we talked about in the podcast as well, this idea that, oh, Black women are doing fine, you guys are fine, you guys are fine, and it translates into a lack of support. So when we aren't making it, where is the infrastructure to help us do so? It's just not there, and it's often perceived that there's not a need for it at all, which, you know, we're damned by our own success, right? We strive and achieve in spite of, and then we're left to kind of twist without that. In the podcast, we also talk about hypervisibility and invisibility. So Kim Leary, who is a former trustee of the college and an alum of the college and an amazing woman, she actually does this work for a living, the outcomes of women and girls of color, and she talks about the idea of being hypervisible and that you stand out, right? We stand out by our smaller numbers, we stand out in any kind of predominantly white institution, we stand out a mile, so we're hypervisible. But then when it comes to the seat of power, and having a place at the table, we're totally invisible. So in terms of setting up the structures that we might need for support, we have no say in that. It doesn't happen. It's not a question. It doesn't come up. And then there's this idea of sexual assault and trauma. And that happens as well. And where is the support for that? And there are definitely stories that I heard in working on this podcast. So I should say the way the podcast functions, so here's a little behind the scenes right now. We sent out a call to every Black woman who had graduated from the college. So that was also already a limitation. It was every Black woman who graduated. Those were the records that the college had, were all the women who had graduated. So we sent out a call to every single Black woman, every single woman who called themselves Black and was in the alumni directory, we sent out a call to them. And everyone who responded back is a woman that I spoke with. And there were some stories of people who did not make it, or who did and were scarred by the experience. One of the main inspirations for the podcast itself was a woman who I met at an alumni event that I hosted in Los Angeles, who graduated from the college, is super successful now, and said that she had not interacted with the college in 30 years since she graduated. Not at all. The only thing she had done is to help students who approached her for mentorship, but otherwise she would have nothing to do with the college. And she wouldn't really get into why. I didn't even have to ask, I could guess. So I'm interested in that. Like I said, this is a conversation, so I wonder if other folks have thoughts. We don't need to get into specifics. We don't need to breach any confidentialities, even though this is a safe space, but I would love to hear thoughts about reconciliation and restoration, what the college should be thinking about, or what you saw from your vantage point. And we do have microphones here.
So I'm so sorry. Actually, one of my questions for you guys is if you could speak closer into the microphone. The acoustics in here are pretty terrible. But other than that, another question, and I mean, all of you, are incredibly successful and brilliant women. So I'm curious, from your perspective, can you talk about models for success? Like on this topic of rejuvenation and reconciliation, how have you been able to overcome the challenges? Or if, I think from your experience, there weren't as many challenges because there was more preparedness from high school. Like, what were the models, if you could pinpoint them, that allowed you to be able to survive, thrive, overcome, et cetera?
I want to hold that one because that is a great topic. I want to hold that one. There are a couple of hands here in the green sweater. Okay, good.
I may be too loud for this. So I just want to thank you all for everything that you're saying, but I particularly tuned into the comment about people of different backgrounds having some trouble when they hit Amherst. I am now a doctor. I was actually not pre-med at Amherst, but completed all the requirements for it, coming out of a school not dissimilar to Deerfield. But I remember seeing in my freshman year that there were lots of Black people who were pre-med, and I remember seeing by the second year that there were almost none. And I'm a 1993 graduate, so I came in '89. And I remember years later telling people, don't go to Amherst out of if you're the best of the best at your Bronx high school, go to City College, go to some place that knows how to take you to the next level, and then apply to Columbia Medical School and get in. But do not bomb out of your dream at the college level. And I have heard that they have made some changes and that there is quite a bit more support now. But I remember noticing and really being struck by the tragedy of these people who were first generation or, were the best of the best at their not great high school, and they came to a great place like Amherst, and they couldn't get to the next step.
Right. So I think there was another comment. I see another, yeah, that one, and then right there. But Zongwen, come this way right here. Yeah, and then, but to the point that you were making, ma'am, you've hit the nail on the head when it comes to STEM. That was exactly the issue at Amherst, is that Amherst was teaching to students who came from an elite STEM background. And if you didn't come from an elite STEM education, whether you were of color or white, rural, poor, whatever it was, if you didn't come from an elite STEM education, you weren't going to survive at Amherst. It was a process. I remember I talked to Ruth Simmons, a former, I read an interview with Ruth Simmons, who's a former president of Smith College, and she talked about a weeding out process. And Amherst wasn't alone, because she was coming from Smith talking about this. There was a weeding out process as opposed to bringing everyone in and saying, we're preparing you to be the doctors you want to be. And the thing is, and Amherst was doing it with this idea that they were teaching for the folks who wanted to be elite researchers, not necessarily the folks who want to be doctors. And the folks who want to be doctors is a much larger group of people from different educational backgrounds who are like, I want to help my community. I want to help this other community. I want to travel and be a doctor, what have you. It's a much larger group of people who come from different educational backgrounds, and Amherst wasn't prepared for that. So, and this was uncovered in the 90s, and Amherst is working on it. So there are initiatives, and the incubator program is specifically a STEM program, so I talk about things come and they go, and they come and they go and they come. So, and it tends to be led by individuals, and so we've got an individual now who is leading the charge on that and making a lot of great progress. And we've seen the cycle, and hopefully we're in a high end of the cycle, and hopefully it will continue. But there are some initiatives on that.
I just want to say something that's a little bit funny related to that. I remember when my father was a physician, and he was an anesthesiologist, and he taught physics applied to anesthesia. So when I got my physics book and I was home from break, he was reviewing it, and he said, I don't understand why they make this so difficult. This is so abstract.
Right. Yeah.
So, and he taught physics.
Right.
So it was funny. Yeah.
Can I chime in as well? So kind of on the vein of these thoughts here as well, just another anecdote sort of related. My father went to Hamilton College, so very similar, obviously, institution, and similar story. Was a first gen, grew up in both Buffalo and Staten Island, and did not have, two parents who went to college like this. So for him, it was very, very much a whole new world, and he set out to do pre-med, and he didn't make it. He didn't do it. He didn't finish. He didn't successfully do the chemistry requirements for it, and I assume he's okay with me sharing this with you all. But obviously, he went on. He had, his own drive. He had his own will to sort of continue and find the resources necessary. But I wanted to just address that sort of what you were saying earlier around some people's successes making it harder for others, and going to Amherst in a post-Obama world where everyone left and right was like, well, we have a black president. How could you complain, right? Like, somebody has reached the highest office in the land. What could possibly be wrong? That was very hard to sort of combat on a day-to-day basis and be here and try to tell people, yes, he made it. That's exciting. We celebrated it. It's wonderful. But there's still a lot of issues. And even on campus, I was actually here for two different Black student body presidents, Tommy Williams and Karen Blake, and I always call them my presidents still. But I worked really closely with those two as well. And so again, it was that conversation around, well, if they can do it, what are the issues? And I think it all comes back to the support systems I was mentioning. There were a lot of, for those who don't know as well, I was here from 2014 to 2018, and there were a lot of grievances around mental health resources and the representation in that office here for support systems for students of color. And so I think those were some of the places that people had a lot of grievances in. And Nichelle alluded to one of the Instagram accounts that I made called @BlackAmherSpeaks. And this kind of started in 2020. Post George Floyd, a friend of mine and I had said, there's this sort of Black movement going around where Black students from different high schools at the time were posting on Instagram anonymous stories of different instances of discrimination, bias, hate speech, etc. And some of the stories were very striking. So we, created that Instagram account. It still exists today. You can go read all of the stories, but a lot of those stories address this exact issue of the support systems, the lack of faculty representation, and all of that. And obviously, yes, we can talk about some of the things that have happened, but it's still not enough. And I think that's at least how we left Amherst, was that it wasn't enough.
So we have a question here.
So from my perspective as an 08 graduate, it's really important to bring up what Kyndall just hinted to, which was faculty. In terms of when we think about redress, when we think about what steps can we make that we can continue to encourage the college to make, we should also think about the power of our amazing professors here and the power of bringing more of those amazing people who represent the values that we all are hoping our students, these new students, as they come to Amherst, that we want the right professors here that are actually able to support and mentor these students through their issues, and most importantly, bringing the number of the overall number of Black women who are in administrative and teaching roles at this school up. That's what I wanted to talk about in this moment, and why I came here was that I know that my success is attached to Professor Common-Sander and many others who were right here, ready to help all of us. But there should have been 4 of them, right? So I would love the panel if they remember specific people and why that person might have inspired them, or how does the student to faculty interaction, I want to hear more about that, or a student to dean interaction. How did those kinds of people help you, and why do we need more of them at this school? I think that's where I think that'll be really good for this moment.
Okay, we're gonna hold that because we have one more question back here, and then we'll get to that. Yeah, back there. Oh, we've got lots. I want to answer that.
Hey, I'm Bilal Muhammad, class of '98. Shout out to Nichelle. And I work here. I've worked here for 21 years in the library, and I've seen the school change very much in the last 20-some years. And what I'll say is a lot of things that Nichelle just brought up is very poignant and cogent to what's happening, because just this semester, I have so many stories, because where I work in the library, it's predominantly female students, and it's predominantly women of color. And just this semester, I had a Black young woman who worked for me, and her dream of becoming a doctor literally died in front of me. She came to work one day, her job is to put books away for 2 hours, and she didn't put one book away that day, because she was just crying and talking to me about, since she was a little girl in Nigeria, all she wanted to do was be a doctor. And it was too hard and too difficult, and she didn't find a way forward. And she was like, I think I'm gonna switch to public health. I'm gonna do all these different things. And I talked to her about her different paths and friends I've known who've done different things. But it's very real, and it's still happening. And what I'll say is, one of the things that I think, 2 things that I think can help change, and shout out to Alan, I see you there, who is on Black at Amherst with me, which is a group that Norm Jones, who's the former head of the DEI here, started, where Black staff and faculty get together once a month. It's unprecedented. We've never done that before. I've worked here 20 years. It's only been going for about 3 years. And we get together and we talk. And I learned something from a professor, Mark Edwards, about his experience trying to come to Amherst, and it starts with the faculty, because he said when he applied, he asked a simple question of, what is Amherst going to do to support me as a black faculty who's like a first-generation person? And the provost was blown away by that question. The provost didn't know what to do with that, because they're just like, well, we're just here to support the students. You should already be great. And he's like, I'm not great. I need help to be great, to help the students. And of all the professors I hear students talk about in the STEM that they say is the best professor who helps them, it's Mark Edwards, time and time again. So to get more people like him, it has to change in a top-down manner that way, where you need more people who are saying, what can Amherst do to support black faculty who come here as, specifically STEM, if it's specifically STEM for black men, black women, and other people of color. And I think it's time. I think the Wade Fellow is a really good thing, but what I've seen change so rapidly this is the second part, in the last 20 years is there's so many black students here, and there's so many different types of black students, and I see a very difference between the black male experience and the black female experience. Why don't we have a Wade Fellow for black women? Why don't we have a Wade Fellow for the Caribbean students who come here, for the Africans? There is a different sort of experience for each one of those students who come here, and to your point of like, why aren't there 4 Rhonda Cobb Sanders? Why aren't there 4 Wade Fellows address the critical base is, the critical mass is there to change these things. There's so many different types of black students who come here, and it's not a monolith anymore, and people need to speak to the specificity of people's different issues that are happening. And so that's all I have to say is I think we should look at those kind of solutions and really look at the faculty and how we're recruiting and supporting the faculty, because those people really set the tenor of what is possible and to change. Because from the time we here to the time my dad went here, the pedagogy has been cut the wheat from the chaff. If you're strong enough, smart enough, fast enough, you will survive. It is not that bring everybody up, and every once in a while you have a Rhonda, you have a Mark, you have this person, but there is no pedagogical shift to change that, and that's why this student failed this semester, and her dream of being a doctor literally died that night in front of me. And stuff like that, and it was heartbreaking. And I mean, I could talk for hours about other students and their experiences. There's a young woman who's working with me right now, and her whole thesis is about sexual assault in black women and how they don't feel supported and how they don't feel seen on campus. That's her literally whole thesis, but she doesn't feel a ton of support because she's Afro-Latino, and she doesn't get a ton of support from the black community because she's Dominican. And it's like there's this whole atomization of the experiences that needs to be addressed now. And we have the critical mass and we have the people, and I think that's what we need to do.
Right, thank you. So really quickly, I want to start answering some of these questions, and I just want to say to Bilal's point, and to Alan, is that your name? Alex. Alex? Okay. To both of your point, it's an obvious point, but I want to say what you guys are pointing out is so important, and it's an obvious point, but I feel like the bedrock premise bears restating, which is that for white students, this plethora of resources already exists, right? You can be a white person interested in this, that, and the other thing, and there are 10 professors, 20 professors, 200 professors that you can pick and choose from as a potential mentor. And for students of color, and all of those professors, the whole institution is geared towards supporting you, supporting the culture that you came from, the mindset that you bring with you, where you might go. It's by you, of you, and for you in a way that's just not for us. And it's hard to see because for you, it's like air. It's normal. This is normal. And for us, it is absolutely not. So when we talk about representation and critical mass and needing more, we really are, it's a real point. It's a real point. I think it's hard to see when this is not your experience, So I just want to make that kind of premise point, remind folks of that one. So we got asked about models of success and mentors, if we could quickly go through.
Yeah, if I can start really quickly. Yeah. So I just want to talk about, I'll talk about the mentors, talk a little bit about models of success. So one of the things that research has shown is that black faculty, as well as other minority faculty, when they're asked to be professors at any college, not just Amherst, often elite colleges, but any, they're often asked to take on additional burdens in addition to their teaching. So like white teachers can just teach really, but black teachers are asked to be teachers and also mentor the students of population who might look like them or have something in common with them, asked to serve on boards, et cetera. So the black student experience really is mirrored in many ways than the black faculty experience. And from my own perspective, like I think of Professor Rhonda Common-Sander, who has this corner office in Cooper House, and she would say to people, "Come talk to me." And Professor Common-Sander is constantly overworked, and like it's hard to get in touch with her. But when you are with her, she will give you all of her attention for like whatever time you need, whatever time she has available. And so you'd sit on that couch, and you'd be like talking about your work and talking about yourself as a human. And there was just like one of those few spaces where you could do that. And I remember when she was asked to actually join to head the kind of diversity inclusion efforts of the college, and she didn't want it. She told them no, and they had to convince her to do that. She told them no repeatedly. And, like the fact that was a thing that there's a woman who's already overworked, who already is doing many, many things more than she's supposed to. And this is who the college felt like is the only person who could handle that burden. It reminds me of the Sonia Sanchez story, and the whole Gerald Penny sort of debacle. I think also of like the black male professors. We talked about one, Bilal talked about one a while ago, but like Professor Ferguson coming down to the cafeteria and holding sessions for the students. Like, just the fact that they're just asked to do so much, and it just means so much, but also just the burden on that person. And the second thing in terms of those models of success, like I said, Deerfield really taught me, navigating the waters. So I remember like Tony Jack would be like, who later wrote the book, The Privileged Poor, which you should read, would come to me and be like, "You went to Deerfield." Like, I remember he was just like, picked me out of nowhere. I'd never spoken to before. He's like, "I heard you went to Deerfield. Come talk to me about it. I want to hear about it." He'd be like, "How did you know that you had to go to office hours?" And I'd be like, "Well, I felt like that's just what was done, because that's what they did at Deerfield. Like, professors were available, teachers were available, you were supposed to go." So I feel like there is something in that model, like, the explicitness. Like, I remember writing and teaching a Professor Common-Sander course about the explicitness of codes and like how making those codes more explicit, and we talk about that in the podcast, like, saying, you have to go here, like, here is how you find that. I was very actually happy when I walked into King today to go take my child to the bathroom to see a poster, "Your ID card is your library card." And immediately that clued me in that like many people did not realize that and that they needed to say that, but I'm glad that they said that, And so I think the ways in which we can surface more codes and make everything more explicit helps everyone, And I also just want to do a quick shout out that like, even I think in the same way that like faculty is working overtime, and that mentorship is working over time. Like Herminia T. Gardner, she was the affirmative action officer at the college from 1993 until she retired. And she started this worship series that I ran twice, and it's still ongoing. It had 2 services this year. It has 2 services every year. And the important part of it is like to give this experience of the Black church at Amherst, because it's such a fundamental part of the African American experience, such a fundamental part of the Black diasporic experience in many ways. And to also offer food that was comfort food for Black American students. So candied yams, collard greens, and it was so meaningful to the Black student population. It was so meaningful to a multicultural population also at Amherst College. But Mrs. Gardner would come back for that, and we always called her Mrs. Gardner. So the fact that I was able to meet somebody who had been at the college long before I attended, but was still connected and still trying to, give the students support even long afterward was just so meaningful to me. She would come and she would talk to you, and she'd be like, "How are you doing? How are you navigating things?" And she would give you advice. And I think that really just summed up what that connection of Black mentorship and that burden of Black mentorship for me.
Just really quickly, one of the things that we didn't get to talk about on the podcast I wanted to talk about so much was Herminia T. Gardner. She was the affirmative action officer at Amherst College, and her position was a result of student protest in 1993, just like Norm Jones' position was a result of student protest in 2015. And she did so much for us as students, which is why the bi-semester worship series was named after her and for her. So I just need to give a shout out to her. She's the one who taught me how to interact with Amherst College after I left. She was the one who told me, okay, here's what you want to do if you want to stay connected to Amherst College. She just sat me down, like you said, made it explicit. There are things that if you have parents who went to colleges like this, who were da-da-da-da-da, you know it already because you've learned by observing your parents, so you don't even think about it. It's what you grew up with. But if you don't, it's not explicit. And you have to be told, because you just, how else would you know? Because you're not in a background where that is obvious to you, whatever your color is. You're not from that background. You need those codes to be just instructions, frankly. So other folks, mentors and models of success. Yeah, we're overdue on answering those other questions, and we'll get right back to you.
Then
And actually, there's a couple people up there who may still have questions, so really quickly.
Do you want to have her answer the question?
Did you guys want to answer the mentors and models of success?
Well,
really
yeah,
fast?
because I went into neuroscience, and the work that I do, which is looking at the neuroscience of language processing, there are very few people who look like us who are in that field, and very few women, but there are a few, and those happen to be the people who were my role models. I didn't have African-American women or African-American male mentors to look for. I just had to do it, and I became the change agent. But for me, the mentors were the fact that I saw women who were really successful in doing this research, and so I just knew that I could do it. The other model was, for me, it happened to be my parents, because they were expecting that.
Right.
And I do remember when I was 12, my father said to me, Nadia, what I expect from you is excellence. I don't expect that because that's what I want from myself. But I expect that because that's what I know that you can give. And so therefore, that's what I expect from you. And he said, but in order for you to achieve that excellence that I know you can deliver, you are going to have to work at 200% at all times. And that's what I'm going to expect from you. And he said, because your 200% will be seen as 70. And
Yeah.
that stayed with me. So when he was like, it's a 95 on 100, I knew where that was coming from. And I actually needed that training in a way since I was 12. Because yes, I did have to go through a lot where people second guessed whether I could do the work, whether I could, what I said I wanted to do, whether I should be doing that. They wanted me to work on something else, and I wasn't interested in that. They pulled the funding. And when I thought about it, I said, why would they pull the funding? It's because most African Americans who are going into the sciences usually don't have a lot of money, so the money was a weapon. But because I was so used to working at 200% at all times, it didn't matter that they pulled the funding. I was going to go around that.
Right.
And I did it. And now I get invited to go back and give talks all the time.
Right. I'll just say, so we have a couple questions, but the 200% being seen as 70, that if you take away nothing, there's that. And the idea that you get invited back to talks, it goes back to the Monopoly analogy, which is right. Like, everyone else is gonna play Monopoly, you're gonna sit and watch them for 2 hours. Now you get to play and try to catch up with them. On the off chance that you beat the insurmountable odds against you, and manage to catch up to them in this game and maybe get to them and maybe win that game, rather than saying, oh, maybe we did that wrong by making you sit out for 2 hours while everybody else was playing. Instead of that, they're like, oh my God, look at what you did. Let's put you on the diversity brochure. And you can tell everyone else how easy it is to play this game.
Or how
We didn't
good
let
their
you play for
program is that
hours.
they let you do that.
Yeah. So, okay, we had a couple questions back here. Did folks still have questions? And I know we have a question here. I know. Okay, we're also at time. So if folks have to go, I totally understand. But if folks want to stay, we have a few more minutes that we can hang out. So there were a couple questions here before this question here. So I don't want to mess up the order. Yeah, if you could, that one right there. And then we got this question down here. There it is.
Hi. First, thank you all for having this panel. So my question is on something Kyndall touched on, which is, hi Kyndall, mental health resources. I remember a lot when I was at Amherst, there was only one counselor who was Black at the time. And we had asked if they can, support and provide more counselors who are Black, because he was the only one who kind of understood the experience we were going through. And for a lot of us, the mental health stigma, especially if you come from a background like me, low income, immigrant, was still very prevalent. So going to a white therapist, they wouldn't really understand what you're going through. So I'm not so sure where Amherst stands on this today, but would love to hear more about the mental health resources that are being provided to the students and what we can do more there.
That was about mental health resources, yeah? I'm probably not the best person to speak on this if other people have. I know that from the work I did on the podcast, we talked to a Dr. Darius McFadden, who is doing amazing work on that front. And so he's the face of it for me. If anyone in the audience wants to add anything, feel free. And we'll get to this other question while that person's thinking about it. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Donna Como, 88, and I'm one of the STEM students before the changes. But what I wanted to just touch on is kind of the reason that those changes started to a certain extent, and it's very much connected to alumni involvement. I was a neuroscience major and applied to medical school. And I was also at the time the teaching assistant for who was the pre-med advisor here. And the pre-med advisor at the time was just a renowned racist, sexist. I mean, he was just known. And when I applied to Harvard Medical School, it just so happened that there was a Black alumni on the admissions committee. And his name is David Pilgrim. And he was on the admissions committee. And he was looking at my application. And I had met him at Amherst Black Alumni Weekend. And so he actually called me and he said, Donella, your application is amazing. Your letters are amazing. But the letter from the pre-med advisor at Amherst is horrible. It doesn't coincide with any of your work, of any of your other letters. So he said, I would like to use your application as a way to show Amherst that the pre-med advisor is racist against the Black students. Can we do that? Yeah, sure. So they used my application to show that he writes letters that don't promote Black people. But it was an Amherst alum who reached out to me who said, Donella, can we do this? Sure, do it. And that's the beauty of Amherst. The beauty of Amherst is the fact that we all know what it's like to go here. And we all know the importance of support. And that, I think, is really the beauty of Amherst.
Right. Thank you. Do we have another program? Is there another program? Yeah. We actually have to go. There's another program coming in today. So thank you so much, everyone. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.